Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me and see me. I definitely can see you. Here is Olga, and I have a very special guest tonight, Daniela.
Hi.
Hi, Daniela. Welcome, everybody, to Money Hour. And it's wonderful for you to zoom in and dial in and listen to us. I hope you can hear us okay. I am using two screens tonight because I am so short-sighted. I can't read very well over a computer screen. So if you see me looking like this, that's me looking at the chat because I need a huge screen in order to be able to read and see. But anyway, I'm more here to administer and to ask Daniela a lot of questions about the future of work, about the future of pensions, and about what we all should be doing to protect and secure, hopefully, our life in a world after Corona. And so, allow me just to quickly show you what is Money Hour, and I will put it here. Basically, those of you who are repeated visitors, welcome back. Those of you who are new, we are a crazy bunch of women meeting every Tuesday to talk about money. Initially, it was Desiree and myself starting this because we felt there needs to be a forum to exchange about the subject of money and how we feel about it and what we want to know about this. And it kind of evolved into this Money Hour and into this forum, and because it would be so boring to just listen to Desiree and myself, we started to invite guests, amazing women from across the globe. Last week we had Jude Kelly speaking to us about 5 things that you should do to be optimistic in sailing the storm. And today I am super happy to have Daniela with us, who will speak, as said, about the pensions. And so most of you probably might know we do this as a free forum, and if you have friends, colleagues, people that want to join, please spread the word. This hour is just for us, and usually it also doesn't take a full hour, it only takes about 30 minutes, and I hope you enjoy today. And I'm going to stop the presentation here at this point in time to give Daniela some room.
Great.
And here we go. Daniela, do you want to say something about yourself? I mean, something fun that maybe we might not know from the description of your CV at the webinar.
So I always start with a fun fact that I did ballet for 9 years. So despite all the reasons why you might not think that I trained as a ballerina, I did. So there you go. So alongside parenting and Woman of the World and PhDs and insurance, I also know how to plie.
That's absolutely wonderful. And do you still practice ballet today?
Yes, sometimes in the privacy of my own room, yes.
Actually, you do, because it's a wonderful thing. You know, there are all these little fun facts. If anyone has a fun fact to be shared about yourself, please put it into the chat. We can see you and we are super curious. Now, Daniela, you are currently doing a PhD, is that correct?
That's right, for my sins.
How long have you been working on the PhD already?
So I've been on it for 2 years, and it's a funded PhD looking at design and social policy. And it's between 2 universities, so that's quite unusual in itself, a proper design school where they design everything from car seats to graphic design, and really, so Central St. Martin's, very famous for its design work, actually. And then very traditionally around social policy. And I came in with the idea that pensions needed to be redesigned in some way, shape, or form. Like you, I had worked in financial services and increasingly felt that the way in which the system was structured and built didn't really reflect our lives and our futures. And that was of my mother, my friends, myself. And I thought this is a huge issue. A huge global issue, a huge national issue, it's a governmental issue, it's a personal issue. If anything is worth redesigning, then let's look at that. So that's what started me on my academic journey of looking at pensions.
And you mentioned that you worked in financial services before, right? So you had a very established career.
Yeah.
And all in a sudden you go onto a PhD. Wasn't that a very bold move that required a lot of courage?
So I live in the UK, and in England, when people say that you're brave, it normally is it's a euphemism for being foolish. And certainly there was a view that, stepping out from, this, as you say, it's difficult to make it, especially as a woman of color in financial services, and to leave for what is, again, a very sort of competitive and difficult environment. Partly, I love the idea of bringing new knowledge into the world. And that motivates me and it drives me as a person. But I also really saw that there was space and impact for someone to look at this issue differently. And, I've been to business school, I've obviously worked in business. When you're driven by margins or you're driven by results, your thinking operates within a certain way in a certain place. And the problem, as it was always framed to me, was that, people don't save enough, women don't save enough. And what I really wanted to know was not, how can we get people to save more? It was, why are people not operating in a way that allows them to be able to live their life course fully? And that might be because they're irrational, but actually I don't believe that the majority of people are irrational. And that just doesn't make sense. Why would the majority of people act against their own interests? Are there ways in which we can facilitate people to be able to age better, to have financial well-being, and throughout their life course, not just when they get old, but in a way that works with people's lives? So it was a question that drove me enough to be able to say that this is worth investigating for years, but a question that doesn't just drive me for sort of personal interest, but because I think the world needs to ask these questions in different ways of ourselves, but also of our structures and our processes and our financial language, to think, actually, how does this really work for how we live our lives now and how we will live our lives in the future, perhaps, as well?
And I think that is so super fascinating. So it's a really broad research subject. I know at one point you told me that you could talk about pensions for something like hours and hours without end. Well, I could listen without end. But
It's a
maybe let's
warning.
start
It's a
there.
warning.
Let's start there. So, what have you discovered? How will this life in future look like, and our work life, and how does that potentially impact our pensions in the next 20, 30, 50 years? I mean, I'm 45 now, right? Almost 45. I still have 20 years to go. Share with us, what have you found out?
Well, I think before you start looking forward, I think it's important to look back and to see where pensions really came from. Certainly, there were pensions going back to medieval times, normally associated with things like sort of soldiers and the military, and it was a way of recompensing people afterwards. But pensions really started not too far from you, in Germany with Bismarck. And this notion of what pensions were and what pensions should be was based around a male notion of what work is, so paid employment, and the idea that when you can no longer do paid employment, that somehow you will be paid back. It was linked with ideas around citizenship. It was linked with ideas around worth, for example. So that idea of function, but actually, and also the idea that your employer, so in reality, even within sort of Bismarck's Germany, the majority of pensions payments were actually made by employers. So this link between an employer who would look after you throughout your journey, and that once, you as a male citizen, let's be honest, got past that point, then the state or your employer would look after you for the rest of time. But we know that even today, before we even look forward, that we don't necessarily live our lives that way. Women live different life courses, partly because of expectation, partly because of choice, partly because of discrimination. And so that system, which has been reinforced over and over again, that looks at rewarding paid employment that isn't necessarily the same as work. Work can be things like looking after children, That doesn't give you pensions contributions necessarily. Work can be working part-time. It can be caring for families. It can be cleaning. All of those things that don't have necessarily an economic value lead to differentials when it comes to pensions. And indeed, when we look at work, most of us are at home at the moment. We're either working from home. Within the UK, a lot of people have been furloughed, so they're part-time, for example. We see the huge impact of things like gig working and not having long-standing permanent work contracts and what that means just in the immediate term. So when we look forward to a world where what does that mean when we haven't necessarily had 30 years with a single employer, with no breaks, no sabbaticals, no part-time working. When we look forward and say, well, actually, the lives that we live, the pensions have been designed for a Victorian life course, for Victorian patterns of working for both men and women. So I think when we think about what the future might be, and we think about what work isn't necessarily just what you get paid for. Work is what you do. And when we look at the relationship between the state, between the individual, between the employer, we really need to reframe how all of that works together. But for me, the really missing element from that is if you look at the World Bank definition of what a pension is, it actually includes family. Because for a large part of the world, actually, they don't have financial products or instruments to be able to support them. So if you live in Nigeria, or if you live in Mexico, or you live in Chile, then it's very likely that your pension will be the social structures that support you and enable you to be able to live out your life when you can no longer do paid employment. And so one of my arguments is that we think about all of those elements as we project forward. We don't know what employment will look like. We don't know if computers will be doing 70, 80, 90% of the work and we'll be, living on a universal basic income. But probably as we get older, we need to think, how can we support ourselves when paid employment might look very different? And also that if we are working for longer, looking after grandchildren, doing academic study or gardening, for example, that's all work, that there are different ways that we could live that out so that we can live good, healthy, quality lives, thinking about that throughout. So I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but for me, it's a much bigger picture than just thinking about financial products alone.
I think that it is a very fascinating picture, and thank you for that, because basically what you are saying is it's a historically formed system in the favor of one line of employment, doesn't take into account any of the work that it today by majority is carried out by women, such as childcare, elderly care, and all of these things. I mean, here in Switzerland, it's billions of Swiss francs every year that women deliver based on free work. And that is not reflected anywhere in the system. And therefore, the whole system needs complete redesign. Now, my question to you would be, do you believe it still will happen in our lifetimes?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that if you had said, we can work differently in a way that nobody has to go to work and nobody goes to school and we'll all stay at home and we'll do everything virtually, and people would have said, it'll never happen. And yet here we are. Often change comes as a result of a crisis. And I do think that as we sit here in what is clearly a crisis, we also see the seeds of opportunity. We see different ways in which the world can work. Things that absolutely you would have been called insane for saying 3, 4 months ago, right? Are happening now. We're talking about payments being made by capitalistic economies. I'm not saying this is what we should do forever, to every single person in the state. We're seeing that schools have been shut down, but everybody is working differently. We're seeing that the government is paying people to stay at home. Now, I'm not saying that these are solutions, but I'm saying that the magnitude shows us what can be possible and how we can really rebalance how we work and how we engage. And I would say it would be very difficult to come out of this to go back to how we were before.
Now, you said your PhD is a funded PhD. Can I ask practical question? How long will it take you still to complete it?
Yeah.
And where will it then go to inform some of these decisions and inform some of this new world, and basically make a difference? And is this a book that we all could buy?
I hope so, to all of those questions. So I've got at least another 2 years. So unfortunately, PhDs are slow pieces of research. I know in business, like research, it's like 3 months and that's it. You've got the results, you've acted it, it's done. There's more procedure, there's more depth to academic research. So unfortunately, it doesn't move particularly quickly. And one of the things that I would say definitely is that, I am very much about action-centered research. So clear recommendations about things that we can do, clear recommendations about ways in which we might at least build in design principles for how we think about effectively funding good, healthy aging. Things that might seem really difficult, like how we deal with things like dementia, for example, as we get older. Actually, that brings in more complexities. It's funded by King's College London, and actually I've worked within the Cabinet Office of the UK as well. So there's a lot of interest in government in terms of looking at things slightly differently. I think that there's room for different partners to get involved. I think financial services actually do a really fantastic job in a huge number of things, but we don't necessarily ask for the right products. So things like protection insurance, I think, is a brilliant thing. You probably know what it is. I'm not sure if the listeners do, but life protection looks at things like if you have a heart attack, for example, you can effectively, it works on your salary. If you get cancer, for example, it will cover you for those things. Now, I think, why would you not have, a risk pooled annuity, for example, that looked at what might happen if you were incapacitated when you were old, for example? The infrastructure is already there. It makes sense in terms of pooled risk. Why not develop a market for new products that can actually help people with the lives that they actually live? What do you really need when you're 85? I think people probably will work for longer, but I think we should redefine what work is, for example. And that doesn't have to be, that you do a terrible job and then you go on a cruise for 20 years. What if we do really good, meaningful work that we really enjoy doing for as long as we possibly can? Then that helps to reframe our relationship between aging and work in the first place, and then bringing in like different generations so that we think about community work in different ways, and we work, maybe we take a few years out in the middle, rather than saving this all up towards the end. So just adding in different ideas and reframing how we think about something rather than perpetuating the same model. So for me, it's about critical futures is actually part of the discipline that it's in. There may be a thousand, millions of other ideas that you might have, but why not think critically about what the future could be? Ultimately, it's not written. So that's part of the approach. That sounds very grandiose, but ultimately, I think is within all of our power to think about how we might do things differently.
Now, having framed this broad issue, right, and the broad challenge that you just outlined, coming to today, to our reality today, there are all these statistics out there and they all don't sound very encouraging, right? In the UK, it's like the woman will be 5 times poorer at the time of her pension than the man will be. In Switzerland, I think we don't have such a precise statistic, but it's about similar. When it comes to a divorce, the woman yet again loses out because she only works part-time, at least in this country. So there are all these stereotypes. Do you think this is just a lot of research to scare people, or do we really have such a massive issue?
The evidence around this is really clear. There's really strong data. And in fact, I always say that it was data that took me into this research in the first place. I know that there's a very often quoted statistic that within the UK, women have 1/5 of the retirement income that men do. I looked at a particular study that was done in 2016, so it was very quick between me seeing the results of that and starting the PhD, that showed that regardless of socioeconomic background, of marriage, of the type of job that you do, in all categories, all women were getting less in terms of their retirement income. They were all financially worse off than their male equivalents. And that to me was stunning. Because very often what you hear is, oh, well, it's because women work in these particular jobs, or it's because women have babies, or they have children, or they do these things. And I thought, if that is so universal, you cannot say that is something that individuals are doing. There must be something that is structural, that means regardless of how you live your life as a woman, that it does look like from the data that you would be financially better off in retirement if you were male. And we also know that if we just talk about sex, not sex and gender, that women live longer than men as well. So you live for longer on less money. And there are lots of reasons why that happens. It's the crystallization very often of discrimination within the workplace, within pay. Actually, for the higher professions, the differential is greater. So if you're a lawyer, or if you work in finance, or you're a doctor, for example, you are more likely to suffer from pay discrimination and equally from pensions discrimination as a result of that.
And do you think that now with everything that's happening, which is both the enormous opportunity that you described and Jude so eloquently framed last time, and it so stuck with me, saying we have this chance to actually recreate a world that is not exactly the same that the one where we have come from. So there is a huge opportunity, but obviously there also are huge challenges. Do you think the current environment will make it worse for women?
I think there's definitely the potential to do that. And history says that post-crisis, we can go in two ways. So that's why I frame this as an opportunity, because if we don't grab the vision of what the future might be, others will do it for us. Ultimately, you can read every situation in two ways. This could be an opportunity to look at how we do work. It could be that actually that people close ranks to say there are fewer jobs, there are fewer opportunities, that we're heading into a very deep economic crisis. Who do you push out? Those who were more marginalized and were more marginalized in the first place. When I talk about sort of leveling up, what I don't see is that wealth is something that men have that women need to take. What I see is that we need a rebalancing of how we live our lives. We need a rebalancing of money as well. I've worked in very male dominated environments, and I would tell you that the mental health issues in those environments were stark. Suicide was a real reality of some of those workplace environments where people would have given anything to take just a year off and to be able to come back. Nobody should have to feel like they have to provide in such a way that their life is not worth living anymore. Why shouldn't men spend more time with their families and not feel that that's a penalty for doing so? Why shouldn't women spend more time in the workplace and not feel that somehow they're not meeting expectations of staying with their family? Why shouldn't people, whether or not they have children or choose that that's a route that they want to take, not decide that they want to rebalance their lives in different ways? So things that might seem pie in the sky might well be, there's lots of research that shows that, you know what, rather than going for a pay rise, why don't you work 4 days a week? There are 7 days in the week. Why don't we work, 7 days? We work 24 hours. We can work like this. There's no reason why we have to be out of the house for a particular set number of hours over a set amount of time. That means that we do that and we trade that off towards the end of our lives. It's actually very easy to rebalance if we see that as an opportunity that actually allows for growth, but in a much more sustainable way, not just at a planetary level, but also at a human and individual and mental health and well-being level.
So besides pushing for, I would say, a broader adoption for different work models and a very different interpretation of what work is, I mean, there are all these fluid models, right? Somebody like me, for instance, works, it never feels like work because I happen to have the privilege to do what I love, but it doesn't necessarily translate into my pension, this love, right? So in your view, what should women do in this current environment to protect themselves?
I think,
To be safe when they are older?
I think it's really important to think about the long term and to think about the long view. And when I say that, I think when people think about pensions, they normally think at the point at which they'd be taking their pension. So 60, 65, for example, they model on their parents. Through the course of my research, through the course of thinking about pensions and lingering on this, I would say, think about what you will need when you're 85. Because if you really start to think through about the long term, there are small changes, there are small things that you can put in place now, what would you need when you're 85? Because it's probably going to be difficult to have to work, 8, 9, 10, 11-hour days if you're 85. And yet that's probably when you're going to need whatever it is the most. A really small investment vehicle might make all the difference. Actually thinking about, often when we look at insurance, for example, there's a context of smoothing. How about smoothing when you work, working in different phases? Investment can be different things. Investment in vehicles that might mature at different points in time, because, thinking about from sort of 65, that pension is going to have to last you, or whatever you call it, that sort of fund for as you get older will need to last you probably 20 to 25 years. So think around that sort of time. It might be that you retrain in such a way that you can work in a different way. Maybe you do something that's very physical. Maybe you're in nursing, for example. Is there a way that you could do something like training, that you could work in a slightly different way that allows you to be able to smooth your work over a longer period of time, and maybe do that for less time? So maybe you don't have enough that means that you can sit on a boat for 20 years, but maybe it means that you could work for 2 days a week for 10 years, and then 1 day a week for 5 years. So I really encourage people to really imagine what life might be when they're sort of 85, and then work their way back from there. How do you think you might get there? What do you think you might need? What will stabilize you within that environment? Because I think that then becomes clearer, because when you're looking at very sort of specific products, they're quite abstract, aren't they? They're sort of, it's a defined benefit scheme. It matures over 10 years or 20 years. But really building a picture, a rich picture of what you think your life might be and what you might need, and then planning for the worst, which especially women are great at doing, I think makes it much easier to then frame and think about what you might need. You probably will need something financial to help you in that time. You might need some form of insurance. You might need some stability in terms of living arrangements, in terms of home. You might need some form of social relationship or support around you, or a proxy for that, for example, and then work your way back from there. But that seems quite abstract because people might have very sort of specific questions. But I do think that building a rich picture of what aging might look like and then planning for the worst is a really good starting point, because then you can start asking specific questions about what sort of product might I have, or might I be able to get access to, that will help me to realize that.
So basically what you are alluding to is to look at a pension or all the life portfolio of different measures where the financial product suite is just one tiny grain, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
In all of that aspect, and you mentioned, people might want to work longer. Do you think it's a good idea to invest in one's health as well? I read all of this Mercer management studies, how people are worried and actually preparing already now for a work life that will carry them long beyond the 65.
Yeah, and I do think that. I think that, every indication says that people will be working, if they can do, beyond 65. And I think people should be preparing for that, both in terms of investing in themselves, physically, emotionally, to be able to sustain that, but also thinking about working in sustainable ways. If you're working like, burning the candles both ends to keep your job in a particular way, you probably won't be able to do that, when you are 63, for example. So think about the ways in which you might work, the ways in which you might be able to support that. We talk about diversifying a portfolio. It seems like a very odd financial conversation to be having, talking about diversifying your portfolio in life, but it makes a lot of sense. If you've got, lots of strings to your bows, lots of different skills, we know that people work in different ways now. They're less likely to be dependent on a single employer. So investing in yourself that enables you to be able to work differently, I think definitely helps to prepare for the future, whatever that might bring.
And so before I quiz you with my final questions around the really practical tips, which I'm sure everybody wants to hear, Risanami, one last question before we come to the practicalities of things. I heard of someone in the UK, actually had a conversation this week, was very enlightening. They are thinking about a new campaign to make people proud of their pensions. And there's actually a tagline, it's like, be proud of your pension, and to make that pension money matter. And there is all this direction around investing sustainably and making the world a different place. Do you think that investing one's pension money sustainably actually does make a difference? Or is it then just taken by the product providers and anyway, it doesn't do any good?
I think there was a huge case for sustainable investment. I think pension funds are significant, and I think that we've already seen a number of pension providers have refused to invest in tobacco companies, refused to invest in carbon-centric organizations, that this can really make a difference on a mass scale. It can really make a difference. However, on an individual level, I think that you do need to make sure that you're making wise decisions as an individual, and that yes, there can be socially backed funds, but I would always advise that people get proper, strong financial advice before you take any particular decisions. Think about things like fees, for example. Are they really going to perform in the way that you need them to perform? So I think, while I think it's really important that we are driven by our ethics and we're driven by what matters to us, I mean, that's how I live my life. I think that people should always navigate really carefully when it comes to investment, to always take qualified advice, and to also look at the long-term performance and what that might mean for you as well.
So with that, me being 45, what's your advice? What should I be doing with my pension very practically now that I know that I actually need to imagine my life at my age of in 40 years, that I should be imagining how will my social life, my work life, my environment look like? But what would be your advice? Should I go and invest now? Should I revisit my product? What are kind of the top 3 tips and tricks, and where would I go? And I know you are not a financial advisor, so this is personal opinion only, but still, just to hear from your expertise.
So within the UK, so I know you're in Switzerland, so I'm going to frame my advice around my guidance around the UK. I think it's really important to know that when we talk about pensions, we're normally talking about 3 different things. So the first thing is, make sure that you're getting your full state contribution. So if you are working for yourself, if you're self-employed, try to draw a salary, if you can do, where you are making national insurance contributions, because all of that adds up towards your state pension. It's not a huge amount, but actually the majority of women never get their full state pension within the UK because they're not contributing towards that. So if you've got, so if you're working for yourself, if you're working freelance, try and at least work in a way where you're at least making your national insurance contributions. If you are working for an employer or have the option of working for an employer, before you make those juicy calculations about what that day rate is, think about what you might be losing in terms of a pension. So even if you're doing a 6-month contract, but that contract allows you to be able to get some form of pension contribution as part of that, I would definitely think about that. And if you truly are working for yourself, I know it's very difficult, but I would definitely think about adding that into your cost of living. Just a little bit that just says that you're thinking about investing financially into what your future might be. I know clearly you've got to pay down debts. There's lots of really practical things about personal finance, but I would just say, just always have that little kind of future self once you've done that, all that good work and all that good analysis, but that little voice that's your future self that just says, don't forget about me. Don't forget that I'm here too, and that I'm going to need a little something. And so when you're making those decisions, just think about that future self and what you might need and what might help that future self just to live a little bit better as you get older and as you age.
And so with that, is there any good source you could point our UK listeners to where they could go, which wouldn't be necessarily a bank or a specific provider, to learn more about pensions, or at least to start calculating, once I imagined the life I'm going to have at 85, to understand how much I need?
Yeah, so there's the Money and Advice Service. I think they've recently been renamed. They're a really good independent source of information. Nest are a workplace provider, but they've got some fantastic, but they're essentially sort of backed by the government. They've got some fantastic, really easy to understand information there. So I think those are really good starting points. But the best thing that, someone can finish this conversation today that you can do based in the UK is just to Google state pension. Just work out how much have you got. If you've ever worked and you've got national insurance contributions, you've got some form of pension there. So just start investigating, build up a picture of what your pension might look like, and then start that journey in terms of just thinking, this is what I might have in terms of state pension. This is what I might have that I picked up from that small job or that job that I've done there in terms of my occupational pension. And what might that look like? What might that translate into as I get older, as that builds up over time? But I think definitely Money and Advice Service is a great starting point. Gov.uk, looking at state pension, just breaking down what it is just a fantastic thing as well. And then also the Nest website, I think it is really good and really simple, just in sort of just looking at occupational pensions and what that might be.
So plenty to do until Daniella and your PhD manages to change the future for all of us. Thank you so much, Daniella. I'm going to open this now to the chat to see if anybody has any question. If you would want to type it into the chat, then Daniella can pick up 2-3 of those. We're going to give you a little moment because the system usually is a little delayed. Yeah. Now I got inspired. I'm already imagining my life at the age of 85, Daniella. To me when I speak to you. I don't know whether I want to be a really fashionable lady that still is working or whether I still want to be like the 85-year-old digital whiz. Haven't set my mind to that yet. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. Desiree, you still there with us?
So I've seen some on the side actually. So
here comes Pat. No, do you see Pat?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here, I'm surprised. That's a good challenge for you, Daniella.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that you say we might need the most when we are 85. Other than Kenyans, I would have thought that 65 till 80 would be the most demanding time for resources.
Okay. Well, I think the reason why I sort of talk about 85 is because often when we think about retirement, we think about ourselves at 65. And most people at 65 are, can work, are healthy. My mum is not far off that age, for example. So most people have energy at 65 if they don't have sort of underlying health conditions. The reason why I sort of say 85 is because paid employment at that point is probably less likely. And when you say other than care needs can be significant. They can be really significant. And so thinking about what that might be, you may be in a care home. I don't know what sort of environment you're in, but you may be living within your own home, for example. Your heating needs, for example, will be different when you're 85. Accessibility, access to information, access to sort of a social life might be quite different. But I would say working your way back from there is just a different way of thinking about retirement. We normally now think about, when we talk about the science of aging or gerontology, about 4 ages. So, that kind of 65 to 75 of going on cruises and playing golf and all of that stuff, that's the 3rd age. And the 4th age is what I'm really sort of talking about, is sort of beyond that is often where the ability to be able to find new funding sources is challenged, which is why I sort of point people to really think about that particular phase of life. But, good challenge, Pat.
So we also received, when you scroll through the chat, a lot of inspiration around kind of your broader vision of adapting the pension system towards, I would say, a more natural lifestyle of people. Maybe to pick up one of those, people were asking, so what would need to happen now that your broader vision of changing the system would come into play, and can it be done faster?
I mean, I think going right back to my roots in business, I think consumer power is really important. And I think disruption is hard. I think sustained disruption is hard. But there are already, as some people have pointed out, community pension type models. We have something that's looking at sort of mutual. I mean, one of the problems with sort of mutual funds, which there's a long history of in the UK, is that they tend to perform less well than purely financialized funds. So there is something within that. But we are looking increasingly at things like CDCs within the UK, which were written off entirely as we look for new kind of solutions. So that's a sort of mix between sort of defined benefit, where a lot of that risk falls on the employer, and defined contribution, where essentially that risk falls on the employee. But there's a kind of hybrid where you kind of pool with your colleagues to say, actually, we would share that risk between us. So there are different models, and I think that collectively, I mean, let's be very clear. If we're talking about women, the majority of pensioners are in fact women. So we've got a lot of collective clout between us to be able to say that we want things to be done differently. The purpose of my research and my aim is to really provoke debate and discussion. But I think that if we're really saying that as a significant force that we can use and design and create products in different ways. It's probably not a particularly great subject to bring up, but we've revolutionized menstrual products within the last 15 years. I mean, absolutely revolutionized, to say this does not work for us or we can do things differently. I see absolutely no reason why we can't do the same with pensions.
And so my final question for tonight then would be, if I want, with my little assets, ignite this revolution starting tonight or tomorrow, what is the one thing that I need to do? So that it changes for all the other women that are yet in their 20s or much younger than I am.
I think that's tough for you to do on your own. What I would say is build a collective, which you're doing, between you, co-design and say, what do we need? Think about things like, what would female-centric investment look like? Because most of those actuarial models are not built on women's lives. I think there's a great, that's not my particular area, but I think if there is someone out there who wants to really look at that, what could female-driven investment look like? I think that would be amazing. So I would, first thing I would say is don't do it on your own. Get other people in there to help redesign with you. But then really think about where the gaps are and how you could build that. And I think you could do amazing things. As I said, I'm offering one vision for the future. You could create multitudes.
So on that high note, we also received a lot of practical questions, for instance, how to calculate care costs coming in here from Pat, and some of the other really practical questions in the chat. So what we are going to do is, unless you want to comment on the care costs, Daniela?
So I think that is a very good question, Pat, around care costs. What I would say at the moment is, that there's a reason why there's a difficult market on care. There are calculations that you can do based on the policy at the moment that you can look at that are based on things like thresholds. But I think social care is a much, much broader question, both in the UK and globally.
So because what I wanted to say is we always download the chat after the webinar, and don't be scared. It's not going to go anywhere. We're not publicizing it, but if there are questions from people that we haven't answered, we kind of try to pick them up. So you all know my email. I'm going to type it one more time. If there are particular questions that you want Daniela to answer, then please feel free to email me. I'm going to forward these questions and see that I can provide you with some answers, because Money Hour is only as useful as we make it. And those of you who have emailed me already know that they do get usually very elaborated, long emails from me. With that, Daniela, thank you so much for sharing your inspiring vision.
Thank you for inviting me.
path for a better life of pension and probably a more adjustable pension scheme for all of us, and for being such an inspiration and for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone. I hope that was helpful, or at least interesting.
It was absolutely helpful and interesting. And with that, everybody who is on Money Hour tonight, we're going to be back next week. I promised, I think in the last Money Hour, that, next week it's going to be a fun Money Hour. So we are aiming to invite some ladies whose art and expertise is not money, but making us laugh. And they are going to be grilling me, being the financial person. So it's going to be the comedians versus the economists. And I hope you will find the time to join us again. I hope you will bring lots of friends, and thank you for being such a wonderful community in these times. For me, the Money Hour is the point in my week where I just absolutely love to get inspiration and to speak to all of you. So thanks for being here tonight. Have a lovely evening. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.